The time is now 18 minutes to 9. The Financial Times is famously printed on pink paper. This morning, it's yellow, or rather there's a yellow wraparound, and the front page has a massive headline: Capitalism, time for a reset. What? Isn't the FT the ultimate cheerleader for capitalism, and hasn't it been with us one way or another forever? So what can have gone so badly wrong that it needs a reset? Martin Wolf is the man who'll be able to answer that question, perhaps because he's the chief economics commentator at the Financial Times. He's in our radio car. With me, Martin Lesh from the free market think tank, the Adam Smith Institute. Martin, are you saying it's broken? Capitalism is broken?
What I'm saying is that it hasn't been performing very well for quite a long time for a very large number of people. And I'm arguing in this piece that one of the reasons for this is we have permitted the emergence of what I call rentier capitalism. That is to say, forms of capitalism in which relatively small groups are able to exploit others because they have monopoly power, because of the way the financial system operates, because of the way competition policy operates, the way the tax system operates. And this is particularly true and crucially in the US, which is, of course, really the home of capitalism, the dominant country. And because of this failure of performance, particularly and crucially with the financial crisis, this has led to profound disillusion in the public. And as a result, we're seeing the emergence of populism of both the left and the right particularly nationalism, protectionism, fundamental assaults even on the rule of law. So I think it's obvious we have a crisis. And since we in the paper and I believe in capitalism, I think we need to reconsider how it's operating, how corporations are governed, how the financial system operates, the role of the state in all this. And that's really why we're talking about a reset. It's obvious it isn't working as we would like it to.
On a very simplistic level, isn't it simply that a relatively small group of people have become immensely greedy and have earned a vast amount of money? I mean, the top 1% of American earners, their incomes jumped from 11% to 20% in the last few years, and they've got to stop. Isn't it a bit more regulation? Isn't that it?
Well, I think that's a very clear symptom, though it's not the only symptom. The other has been the dramatic decline in productivity growth, actually across the Western world, particularly since the crisis. And so they're not performing in terms of innovation, though we talk about innovation all the time. But while I think this is a symptom of rent extraction. In the US, the top 1% now earns twice as much as the whole bottom 50%, which is twice as big a share as 40 years ago. And it's not at all obvious that that has gone with improved performance. So I think to fix this, to make the system work better, and I'm not an absolute egalitarian at all, but to make it work better, you have to ask yourself not what we see in the symptom, which you describe, but what is generating that result. And I'm arguing it's because market capitalism is actually not functioning as it ought to.
And Matt Lesh, you don't accept that?
Look, I think the story of recent history is actually a lot more positive. Now, what you actually get rich and successful for these days is largely providing value to others. If you look at the Times Rich List, the big story of the last 30 years is it used to be full of aristocrats and landowners. Now it's full of entrepreneurs and inventors. And I also would totally reject the idea that we're not seeing innovations or benefit to consumers. Over the last 30 years, we've seen technologies like the smartphone that has more processing power in our pockets than the Apollo spacecraft when it landed in the moon.
And it's made a few people very, very, very rich.
But it's actually made us all rich. It's all benefit the access we can have to information in our pockets. It's talked a lot about in the US, the example of Walmart. The founders of Walmart are extremely rich, but actually something like 95% of the benefit of Walmart actually goes to consumers in cheaper
So why the
products.
unease then, well, more than unease, unrest that Martin describes?
Well, I think
on the part of ordinary people, I mean.
I think often you can equate these issues like inequality with something that's actually more fundamentally about identity and culture when it comes to political divides and political trends.
Well, we've always had those differences.
Well, we have, but they've definitely escalated. Something Martin does pick up in his piece is this idea in which we have an inner city class of cosmopolitan, highly educated elites who are doing very well out of the system. That doesn't mean everyone else is losing out, but it does mean that you've got a cultural divide.
And that's an important point, isn't it, Martin? It doesn't mean that everybody else is losing out.
Well, I mean, the evidence, unfortunately, isn't consistent with what's being said. It's a good expression of the religion, but it isn't true. The evidence is that we can easily point to wonderful technologies. We've had wonderful technologies for the last 2 centuries, by the way. But actually, overall, the rate of growth of productivity has slowed dramatically. And people have looked at that and said, is it just measurement error? No, it isn't. Second, yes, vast fortunes have been made by successful entrepreneurs. I have no problem with the Google founders making lots of money. But a huge part of this is an enormous increases in salaries and incomes in the financial sector. Does anyone really believe that that's generating value after probably the biggest financial crisis in history, followed by years of essentially stagnant real incomes? So it seems to me just ludicrously complacent to say everything is absolutely fine and working as it should. And my own argument very strongly is that, consistent with historical experience, huge financial crises always destabilize politics. They did in the 30s. They've done it again in the last decade. And this isn't just culture. It's culture which is made much more bitter because of what is to many people economic failure. And that's just the reality.
Look, I just think often these claims, particularly about inequality, really often don't actually stack up. If you look at the Office of National Statistics, they'll tell you that income inequality remains at slightly lower levels than it did 12 years ago. We've got a record low unemployment rate, which means that more people in jobs at just 3.8%. Income growth is starting to come again in the US and the UK. Obviously, there are issues with tariffs. There are issues with our politics, and there's absolutely need for reform. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think complacency is absolutely what we don't need. But I think we need to appreciate and sell the successes of the system we have, because I think the problem with trying to undermine the basics is that you don't lead to simple reform. You lead to reforms that undermine the entire system.
All right. I wish we had another 3 hours for that, but then you still wouldn't agree because you're economists, aren't you? Matt Lesh, Martin Wolf, thank you both very much.